So we're going to talk about functions first. We'll talk in a few weeks. We'll make our own functions. But for now, we're using functions that are created by P5 for us to use. And the syntax of a function has a few different parts. And so I want to talk about those parts just so you know what those parts are while you're using them. So this is more of just kind of a syntax thing. But I'm going to go over to the P5 editor and just write some code. I'm actually not going to do a P5 sketch. I'm just going to write some what's called vanilla JavaScript. Vanilla JavaScript is just plain code that doesn't use any library like the P5 library. But we can do that in P5. I can just delete the defaults that they put in here and write my own what's called vanilla JavaScript. Hey, how's it going? Are you here for MMP 210?
Yeah.
What's your name? Say it again. Dion? Oh, okay, we just saw your sketch. It looked good. Yeah. Yeah. You can grab a computer if you need one in the back closet. Okay. So yeah, what we're going to do is just talk about functions. So I'm going to call this function syntax example. And I'll put a comment at the beginning and say this is our function syntax example. Okay. And what we're going to do is just make some functions that print stuff to the console. So it'll be a good chance for us to talk about a little bit about how the console works as well. But we'll cover that more next week when we talk about debugging our code. What is a function? So, oh, that's too big. Whoops. Let me make my text a little bit bigger. Okay, so in programming, in JavaScript, in P5, and any programming language, for the most part, the way that we divide up our code is into blocks of code that we assign to functions. So anytime you start a new P5 sketch, by default, you're going to see these two functions, set up and draw. And so these are examples of function declarations. And a function declaration is just a way of declaring a block of code. So a function is a block of code assigned to a function name. Or we can really even just call it a name. So we just assign a block of code to a name, and that by doing that, we can call that code, we can make that code run when we want to. So we can run it multiple times, we can run it once, we can decide when to run it. In P5, we use these default functions, and there's sort of a weird thing happening where those functions are being declared for us, but we're not actually running the functions. We're not saying when we want them to run. P5 does that for us. And then when we do stuff like background or circle, we're actually running a function, but we're running a function that we didn't create. So when we get started with P5, one of the things that's kind of confusing is that the process of creating and running a function is kind of obscured because we see both sides of it, but not connected to each other. So that's why I want to just make a function on our own so we can see how it works. So when we create a function, it's called a function declaration. This means we're telling the program we want this function to exist and we want it to run this block of code. Okay, so let's make a function. This will be our example function. So when we declare a function, we just use the word function. It turns yellow because it's a JavaScript keyword. And by turning it yellow or whatever color you see in your editor, P5 is kind of telling us this is a special word. And so that highlighting kind of lets us know that we are using a special word. And it's kind of useful because if I spell it wrong, which is easy to do, we'll see that it's not highlighted the right color. And so that's a little bit of a hint that, we spelled it wrong. Okay, so we start with the function keyword. Then we can use any name we want as long as it starts with a letter. You can't start with like, a number or a symbol. You can only start with a letter, and typically we start with a lowercase letter. So let's say we want to create a function that adds 2 numbers. We could say add and then 2 numbers. This is just the name of the function. The name doesn't matter. The important thing is that the name of the function makes sense to the person who's reading it, and that it matches when you use it other times. So when you were writing your regular P5, you might have noticed at some point, let's say I'm drawing this circle, and that runs, and that's fine. You might have you might have misspelled. Sometimes I spell circle and I get the C and the L backwards, and I do something like that, and then we don't see anything, and we get that red line, and P5 says, this isn't defined because it doesn't match the function that we're trying to run. So the important thing with a function is that the name should describe what it does. So name should describe what function does, and it has to match. Has to match when we use it. So declaring the function just makes the function exist. It doesn't actually run the code. Okay, so we're going to add 2 numbers. And for now, I'm just going to console.log 1 + 1. And we'll make some modifications to this as we continue. 1 + 1. So if you know what console.log does, you would expect this function to log the number 2. Actually, let's just go ahead and do it. So before I do anything else, let's just go ahead and say console.log 1 + 1. And you'll see that when I run this code, the console logs 2 right here. So that's what we would expect console.log to do. And we'll talk about this more next week, but basically the console, as we discussed last week, is the JavaScript console where we can debug our code. And .log is we can log something to the console. So developers use this to test our code to see if something works or if it looks like what we expect it to look like. So when we say console.log 1 + 1, we expect the result to be that we see 2 in the console. Okay, so let's delete that and let's run our code again. And notice that we don't see that 2, even though I have console.log right here. So we would expect that 2 to appear if this code was run. But when we declare a function, it doesn't run the code. It just saves the idea, this block of code. But we have to actually run the function for that code to be executed. So when we run a function, we just use the name again. So if we want to use the code or run the function, there's different words that people use for this. The technical term is invoke. So invoke a function. This is, some people will say run, call, use. It all kind of means the same thing. It just means that we want to actually run the code that's in that function. So to do this, I just say add 2 numbers, and that runs my function. So I don't use the function keyword. I just use the name of the function followed by the parentheses. And that should kind of make sense because we have been writing functions. When I write circle, this is invoking or calling the circle function, which draws the circle. So now we've done both parts. We've declared the function and we've invoked the function. So now when I run this and we look in the console, if I can get it up here, now we can see our function is working. Okay, so let's talk about one thing. Let's talk about a couple of things. The way that we name the function, you might have noticed that it looks kind of weird because I started with a lowercase letter and then I used uppercase letters as I added words. When we name a function, so naming a function, we use camel case. Use camel case. And this is true for basically everything in JavaScript except for objects, which we may or may not learn about later in the semester. Camel case is named camel case because it has like a bump. It's like a camel. You know, camels have humps. You guys are familiar with camels? Cool. So we call it that because we add a hump. We capitalize words that come after the first word. That just makes it easier to read. When you name a function, you can't use spaces. So I can't say something like this, add two numbers. If I do something like that, I'm going to get an error. So if I try to run this code, it says unexpected identifier 2. It doesn't understand if there's a space here. It's expecting the next part of the code to start. So we can't use spaces. In some languages like Python, you may see underscores replace spaces. That's perfectly acceptable in JavaScript, but it's not the convention that we use. JavaScript uses the camel case convention. So that's just really a matter of preference, but it's the preference that's developed within the JavaScript community. So if we want to name this the way we expect to, we use camel case. So anytime we add another word, we capitalize that word. So I'll just put a note here. So lowercase first word. And if there's only one word, like setup or draw, it's just all lowercase. Words. Okay, capitalize subsequent words. Subsequent just means words that come after the first word. All right, so let's do something a little bit more interesting with our function. So functions can have arguments. Arguments are the numbers that we put in the parentheses that change the way that the function works. So when we draw a circle, these numbers, 200, 200, 200, they change the position and the size of the circle. And if we change these numbers, if I change the size, we see a different result. So the function always draws a circle, but depending on what the arguments we put in, we get different circles that look different. So arguments are kind of like the ingredients of a recipe. If you have a recipe to make a sandwich, the sandwich process is always the same. You take out the bread, slice the bread, get a knife, get some peanut butter, put the peanut butter on the one slice, put the jelly on the other slice. That process is like the function. The arguments are like the ingredients that we put in. So you might have peanut butter, or you might substitute peanut butter with marshmallow or something like that. So when we create a function, we can have arguments. The arguments change how the function works. So let's rewrite our add two numbers function. So we'll say function add two numbers. And this is actually allowed in JavaScript. I can just write a new function and it'll just take over the previous function. This isn't really allowed in other languages, but since we're using JavaScript, we don't really care. When we add arguments, the order of the arguments can be important. In this one, it's not really going to be because we're just adding the numbers. The result is going to be the same regardless of what order we do it in. But you remember from drawing rectangles and circles that the order of the numbers that you use, the arguments, changes what they mean. So it could be the position, it could be the size. So let's add two numbers. We'll have n1, n2. When we add arguments to a function like this is implicitly declaring a variable. We haven't learned variables yet, so that doesn't make any sense, but we will learn them either next week or the week after. But now we have these things n1 and n2 that we can use. So now I can say console.log n1 plus n2. And now my function is a little bit more interesting because I can add two different numbers. It doesn't have to be 1 plus 1. So now when I say add two numbers, instead of 1 plus 1, let's add 2 and 2. So this 2 is going to go into this n1 argument, and this 2 is going to go into this n2 argument, which is just short for number 1, number 2. And then we'll log the result of adding them together. So if we run this code, this first one we get, it says nan. I'll talk about that in a second, but ignore that for now. Notice the second one we get is 4. So that's good. The reason we get nan for the first one is even though I rewrote my two numbers function, I'm still calling it up here, and I'm not putting in any arguments. So when I don't put any arguments in here, JavaScript is trying to add two numbers that don't exist, And what it results in, instead of a number, I get nan. Nan is short for not a number. So this is an error that's telling me what you're doing doesn't work. We'll talk about errors a little bit more next week when we go over debugging. But you can see the difference between trying to call a function with the correct arguments versus missing arguments. We can see that in a regular P5 sketch. If I forget an argument for my circle, I'm not going to get a circle because it doesn't understand what size I'm trying to draw the circle. And P5 will probably tell me I'm missing an argument. So we can add any two numbers we want using this function, and we can call it as many times as we want to. So if I add 101, we're going to log out 101. If I add 1 million, I think that's a million, and 2, whoops. Oh, I forgot the S at the end. We'll get 1,000,002. We can even do math inside the arguments. I could say add two numbers, but the numbers I want to add are 500 and 200 plus 200. That'll give us 900. So we can really put anything we want into these arguments. If we add arguments that don't exist, then they just get ignored. So if I want to add 1, 1, and 1, it's going to result in, you can see the last number there is 2. Because there's no N3, it only works with the arguments that are defined in the original function declaration. So those are functions. We're not actually going to write our own functions in P5 for a few more weeks because we're going to learn some more basics first. But I just wanted to talk about the basic syntax so it makes a little bit more sense when we're using functions in P5. Okay, so I'm going to save this example, and I'm going to add this to our class collection. I'm going to stop this recording, and I'll start a new one for the color example.